Harsha has been around the Overwatch scene in various capacities. Part 1 of his interview with GGRecon, we focused on his time as an analyst on the San Francisco Shock, him missing out on a job with the Washington Justice, how he got with the Titans and the complications there, as well as his views on the runaway Titans' seemingly untimely demise. In the second half of the interview, we go further down the timeline of his career, touching upon how he got with the Outlaws, despite other offers on the table, and became their head coach in Season 3. We also talked about what went wrong during this season and what could have been improved. Finally, we arrive in the now, discussing the signings for both the staff and roster for Season 4, while fleshing out the vision the Outlaws have in mind for 2021. Please enjoy part 2 of this GGRecon interview with co-head coach of the Houston Outlaws, Harsha. Now, okay, so that season concludes. You get offers, as you said, Vancouver even offered you a new one. Did you always have in mind that you wanted to be a head coach, that was the logical next decision? And why did you end up taking the Outlaws job then?
Yes and no. I had a bunch of different offers, basically, like anywhere between assistant coach, head coach, and GM for like a lot of teams in the league, actually. I think that basically, like, for me, it came down to two teams, and actually, which they weren't Vancouver, so it was Houston and maybe I'll just say this now because like it's not that big of a deal now because everything has changed. It was between Houston and Paris, actually, and so me and 9K would have joined Paris together if I had gone to Paris, basically. But for me. And that would have been with me as GM and 9K as head coach.
Right.
And, looking back on that now, probably better I made the decision that I did because, that Paris obviously doesn't exist anymore. But
right.
For me, it came down to like what was enticing to me about going to Houston is a few things. One, it's like my hometown, actually. So I was born and raised in Houston. Two, I would say I was like told a lot of things about the team that made it seem like very promising to me going into the season. And then like, it was just a really, like, for me, I really wanted the opportunity to like prove myself. And then, you could definitely say from last season's performance, I haven't had that during my like Houston tenure, but at least for me at the time, that was what was going through my head. So those three factors, I would say.
Right. So what was you joined Outlaws as the coach. What was the pre-existing condition of the team, and what kind of roster building schemes, to explain the framework quickly for the viewers? Like, some teams say, for instance, the easiest is probably the Spitfire to explain this. You should focus on a Western roster with European and maybe American players. And that's what we want to market around and what we want to build around. That's like a roster building scheme, as I call them, right? And then other teams have no regulations and can just build the best team they want. So what kind of pre-existing roster building schemes did you have? What were your resources like in terms of like comparatively to other teams? And what was the situation like?
Basically, when I signed, this is before the current company that owns us, Beasley. This was before they were involved with Outlaws. So I was signed to a team that was owned by Valiant, basically, and was operating like independently. I would say maybe a little bit irresponsibly, like kind of using money in like a way I don't think would be necessarily like smart to use the money that they had. And so when I was like talking to them about joining, I was like coaxing the idea of a mixed Korean and American roster, or a mixed Korean and Western roster. Sorry, not American. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of like the idea I had in my head. Like, I had a very long list of free agents that I wanted to tackle. I can actually. I think that last year probably gives people like the perception that I can't scout, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But like, I was really disappointed with how the last offseason actually like went, because I had like a very long list of like I thought top tier free agents that I like wanted to tackle, and then I was like given like a lot of reasons that we couldn't go for them, or like just like it just felt very odd to me.
Mm-hmm.
And then the signings that were made until I would say that the signings that were made were like not necessarily made with my my buy-in, or like without being necessarily like told to me ahead of time. Like it was just two different roster building philosophies on the team, and mine didn't prevail until like we had signed Meko, Jexy, and Rapel. So those are the people I had input in.
Mm-hmm.
But originally, like there's so many free agents that I wanted to like tackle that like we had just scrimmed XL2 a bunch in Vancouver Titans, and so I knew that KSP was a really good player. He's someone that I wanted to talk to. Myeonbong and Krong I was talking to as a deal, except that didn't go through because Myeonbong ended up going to Boston very early in the free agency period because he was kind of pressured in that deal. And then the opportunity arose between Meko and Krong, and I chose Meko because I felt that Krong had maybe a higher peak, but he hadn't played in America. And I felt that Meko was one of the best off tanks in the league anyways. And I actually still feel that to this day. Like he's a really, really strong off tank player, has like good English, and I thought he was like a pretty good fit for our team. I named KSP, Myeonbong, Krong, Meko. Oh, FD God is someone that we tested like really extensively. If we had the budget for a translator at the time, because our budget was like pretty mismanaged before Beasley came in, we would have probably got FD God, and then we probably would have had like a translator for Meko and Rapel. But like essentially, like I felt like we had talked to a bunch of top tier free agents, and we were just given reasons that we couldn't sign like any of them. So I was really disappointed going into the season because of that. It felt like the team was like a very big mishmash of like people that came from different backgrounds and didn't necessarily like mesh well together. And that's not to say that I want to alleviate like my responsibility from like making that team cohesive.
Right.
Because I was at the end of the day the head coach of the Houston Outlaws, so that means I'm the one that has to make those parts function together. But I think also at the same time, I felt like one of my biggest strengths in Overwatch, like throughout every season I've been in Overwatch League, was scouting, and like that I didn't get to do that in the first team that I was in charge of was like really, I think, disappointing to me, I guess, at least.
Were decisions like resigning Boink and then, I guess, having Hydration and Blase at the same time, did those precede you?
So basically, the only players I really had input in signing were Meko, Jexy, and Rapel. I was asked about Hydration. I did say that we should. I thought he was a good player. That's like, it could be worth signing him. So I would say those four were the people that I had like input in.
Right.
And then a lot of the players were obviously on existing contracts from Outlaws beforehand.
So, okay, so from the get-go, you felt like you maybe had not everything under your control, and like there were already some things that you had to work around. Is what I'm gathering. Is that a fair summary?
I think that's a fair summary, but then I think I also have to acknowledge that head coaches are responsible for like the team's performance at the end of the day. So like, even so, I think I still need to put together like a better picture at the end of the day, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because I remember, of course, pre-COVID, the idea was to have a mid-season invitational or tournament. I think it would have been the first 9 games qualify for you for that tournament. I looked at your schedule, and
it was one of the easiest schedules for sure.
And you had a pretty easy schedule. To be fair, in hindsight, I think you had Paris there. Because of like age limitations and whatnot, we thought Paris wasn't going to be that good. I would argue they probably weren't as good as they turned out to be at that time still, but of course, still a much better roster than initially anticipated by a lot of people. And then...
So we actually ended up playing Paris twice, Philadelphia and New York at that beginning. So like, I think at the end of the day, it ended up not being as easy. But then there were still so many winnable games that that we lost. We were just a really bad team during that first meta of the season. And to be honest, like that one stung a bit because I think that there's so many things that could have gone differently. I think that one thing is we started scrimming in America, and we were scrimming against teams like Dallas, Atlanta, Valiant, et cetera, like before the season. And we were really strong in those scrims at the time. Like we were beating most of these teams like pretty handily. So we were like definitely a really confident team. And then going into the first weeks of the season, the meta changed over to like that May McCree like rush style. Issues came up where we couldn't like necessarily use the roster that we thought would be best for that kind of style. And then just like I just honestly never like had the best never like translated the best understanding of that to the players anyways. And I think that I tried to be a little bit cute with how I like substituted support players also. That I know people definitely I look back in hindsight and think that was like really stupid of me. But like basically like I think that we just hadn't been I just hadn't set us up for success at the very beginning. Eventually, after 2 weeks of that meta, I was just like, okay, we need solutions. Like this isn't gonna, fix itself. So we talked as like a group. We ended up finding reintegrating like LiNkzr into the team. So that was like one really big positive for us because we finally had like a hit scan player. And then we also found like that counter comp style of like the Doom Sombra. And we were able to make that work like really well. And we had a really good Doomfist player in Blase and a really good Sombra player in Danteh. So we were able to like kind of play to our strengths fully. And so at our homestand, we like barely lost to London 3-2 when London was like picking up steam. I would say they were like a decent team at the beginning of that season.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how I'd track them in the end because like every team's just fluctuated pretty massively during the season. But then and then we beat Toronto obviously at the homestand and then like picked up steam from there. Like we 3-0'd Paris the next week. Started putting up more and more wins. But then as you said, like our easy part of the schedule was like very concentrated. And then things had changed because of COVID where they had to like change the matchup format. So if you look at our last few weeks of the season, the way it played out was like one month we'd play like Shock, let's say like Shock, Atlanta, Dallas. 1 month we'd play Florida, Philly, Gladiators. 1 month we'd play Shock again, Valiant, like Dallas. Like the way it played out was very weird. So we had all of our easy matches at the time we were the worst as a team.
Yeah.
And then we had all of our hardest matches at the time we were strongest as a team. So it obviously that's just like something that happened is like not not something you can really blame. But I guess that was definitely a little bit discouraging. So the competition obviously just got tougher as we improved.
Right. So there were a couple of things in there I think people will find interesting. And the first one is the decision to, I think, Rapel and Rawkus switch pretty frequently. Of course, you could say like some of the pattern was that Rawkus was just a very good Ana player, probably also personality for your team or leadership figure, calling structures. But I remember that wasn't the clear pattern, and that Rapel probably also played.
The way we had played it out in the first 2 weeks, and we just changed this immediately when it just wasn't going to work. Basically, we wanted to play like Rawkus on like the very the maps that were like very flank heavy and like that relied on like how's it best to frame this? Like we played Rapel on the really straightforward maps, and we played Rawkus on like the maps where like communication was really important. Like we noticed that Rapel had like a pattern of like dying to things that were being called out, like his English just wasn't good enough. So we felt like Rapel's skill came from his mechanics, but then Rawkus' skill came from his communication, and that's why we played it the way we did. In hindsight, obviously, that just wasn't the right call, and I should have just like picked. I actually probably should have just like picked. At the time, Ana was meta, so I think I should have just played Rawkus because he had a really strong Ana. But like but like that was kind of the logic behind it, and obviously it didn't work out. I think that I tried to be too cute with the roster. I would say there are teams that learned the same mistake as me, but I don't think their mistakes were as egregious, I guess, as like switching the flex support, like Shock when they like kind of hard forced Sinatra in the lineup and then lost because like they weren't able to kind of adapt to the meta rather than like forcing one person in the lineup at all times. So it's just a lesson that I learned at the beginning of the season, and tried not to have it occur again.
Mm-hmm. And then the second thing that I caught up from the previous answer was, and I think if we look at LiNkzr's career, it's also a pattern that he seems to be a sensitive player, but he also seems to be a player that is really streaky and like inconsistent in the performances, where like sometimes he actually is one of the best performing players on specific heroes. Like I remember in season 1, we often talked about him as one of the best Widows in the league. Even previously, before Overwatch League, he was kind of a player that emerged as one of the best in the scenes that he was competing in, and then eventually he would just submerge for a while once again. Is that a pattern that you guys had to work around, or did you fail to integrate him in some way into the patterns of the team, or what was the reason for not seeing LiNkzr as much last season?
So basically, to answer like the first part of the question, I don't feel that his streaking, like I don't feel that he was streaky last year. I actually was very happy with how LiNkzr played like last season, to be honest. Like I thought he like contributed a lot to the team. And I think that, so I guess at the beginning of the season he just wasn't playing. I'll just say for like personal reasons. I think that it would have been like a really big boon to have him as like the McCree player for the team, and
right.
Obviously that was a added stress for Blase, who had to play that role. And in hindsight, we should have just like played anti-meta rather than leaning into the meta when we didn't have like the roster to perform in that meta, right? So that's something I obviously feel pretty like, I would say just regretful about. I think that it's probably also hurt Blase's reputation. Like, I don't think that he should be remembered for his McCree. I think he should be remembered for his like his Doomfist, his Genji, stuff like that. So obviously that's something that was just like a hardship we had to deal with at the beginning of the season. When the season, obviously LiNkzr came back during our first homestand, and I think he played pretty well. And then the season converted to online, and he was just available from then on. We entered a period where like the hero pools happened, and then we like were changing hero pools every week, and so the meta changed every week, and so what we could play changed every week. So I think that there was a lot of time where it was like Blase and Danteh or LiNkzr and Danteh, and it would switch back and forth early on, and then Double Shield became the very clear like strongest playstyle with like the Ashe Tracer, the Widow Tracer. And then I would say when that happened, LiNkzr just became like integral to the team. He and Danteh were just like really I felt like they got better and better as time went on like the Ashe Tracer, the Widow Tracer style, and to the point where like we became like a very solid team, I would say, during the Double Shield meta. There's obviously like the match where we beat Florida during the playoff for, I think, whatever that month was, June, July. Mm-hmm. Like we beat Florida, and then we had a match against Philly, who ended up going to the finals of that tournament, and we lost. But like I felt like there were times during the season where we could rely on Danteh and LiNkzr, and I felt like we were able to rely on him throughout the season after he was like kind of reintegrated into the lineup. Yeah. And one thing I really like appreciated about LiNkzr, I think also, is that he was super active and like talkative in feedback. He's like, he always wanted to like contribute his opinion. He always wanted to like just like help the team. And so I think that, I don't know, I felt like he was just really motivated last season. And I feel like he, maybe season 1 he had some of the highest peaks of his career, but I felt like he definitely had a very good performance throughout season 3.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So another player that for that season in particular was a pretty big question mark as to the development and like the overall performance was Muma. Now, Muma was always, I think, we thought of him as one of the solid English-speaking main tanks throughout Season 1. Had a really good Winston. Season 2, I mean, was in the wake of the Outlaws, and tanks are hard to evaluate. So there was some expectations that once we're getting maybe back to Winston, or if we had just more consistency and throughout the entire roster, that Muma would once again find to form. So what happened to Muma throughout Season 3?
I guess that obviously it started with him playing for like the first third of the season, I guess, then splitting time with Hydration for a week, and then Hydration we played with for the rest of the season. What it came down to was like two factors, basically. I think that like Hydration was just a more consistent communicator with the team. Like we could kind of tell him what we wanted out of him, and he would do it, and he would like never forget to do it. It would be like he could drill it into his mind like really easily. And so that's part of the reason that we like decided to work with Hydration as like a backup main tank early on, and then decided during the season to give him the chance to make him the starter. The other thing is that Muma also had a recurring like wrist injury, and that made it so that we were never able to reintegrate him into the lineup. So there were times that I actually did want to try and work Muma back in, and then he'd have a hand injury like 2 scrims in a row, and then we're like, okay, well, you know, we can't waste time when we have 1 week to prepare for a hero pool. So it just became a situation where like because of this injury, because he didn't want to go to like he didn't really want to go to a hospital to get it checked out because of COVID. Obviously he was worried that like going into like a high density COVID environment would be like, you know, not great, especially when he lived with somebody else at the time. Like it just became a situation where we didn't feel like we had the time to afford reintegrating Muma into the roster. So it was just like Hydration's consistency, and then also like the recurring injury that became the two biggest like reasons, I would say.
Right. Okay. Considering you said the hero pool term, I suppose sure. I have to ask the obligatory question. I'm sorry to the listeners that can't hear the discussion around that topic anymore, but I think it's an interesting and also important one to address for the next season, which is basically my understanding is that teams were told pretty late in the season that hero pools would even be happening, and
we
then
didn't know until like week 2 of the regular season already had happened.
Right. So of course, all your roster building at this point is long done. Do you think that? I guess also from this season's perspective, would you have liked to be able to factor in that requirement for flexibility more into your choices for the offseason in terms of the players?
Yes and no, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel like there's like a particular need to have a stable 6 or a stable 7 always in. So in that sense, I don't think flexibility is like the be all end all of playing Overwatch. Like the way I felt is like last season, if you talk about like, let's say Shock, that's a team where like people who like they had a Tracer specialist where Tracer was strong the whole season. They had a hit scan specialist where hit scan was strong the whole season. And then they were able to bring in like other people for other roles. Like I think that, or you know, Shanghai is not a good example, so I don't want to use them because they like pretty much always kind of defaulted back to one specific style. Just in general, though, I feel like flexibility was kind of just an overrated thing in that season. Like I felt like specialists ended up being really strong players. Like, I would say there are like exceptions to that. Obviously, like I would say Fleta would be an exception to that. Prophet would be an exception to that. But then, like, I still at the end of the day felt like the people who were strongest at the characters in that meta, who were on good teams, won. If that makes sense. So, I think it. At the same time, I do think that hero pools need to be factored into scouting and into building a roster. And so, you know, obviously that news would have been welcome earlier than it came. But it's also, I don't know the format for season 4 of Overwatch League, but hero pools were obviously something that we took into account when we scouted out for the new team.
Right. Because, I mean, the way you describe it is like, if you have a specialist for a particular meta, you're going to be good. Now, if we're going mean and lean, and a bunch of teams are limited to 7 players,
sure.
Is it a dice roll?
No, then you're right. Then I think you do need to be flexible.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So it's definitely different depending on how you build the team.
Right. Now, how did that development work then for this season? Because I think you're currently at 9 players. I assume you have to allocate a budget, right? So you get told, and by the way, this is a topic that people don't seem to really have on record in the wider community. You have to set up a salary budget and a buyout budget, and those don't necessarily are easy to mix, right? But the assumption is that you get told by your org what the possibility for this season is, and then you allocate the budget accordingly. So you could go, I'm going to get 7 of the best players I can think I can get for my money, or I can go, maybe I'll get 9 players as you guys did. So was that a conscious decision to say we're going to be a little bit bigger than what some of the teams are going with? And that means we will have to make some, we have to configure around not getting first pick on the best agents? Or was it more, this is just how it happened?
I would say it's just how it happened. I think that we always kind of aimed for like 8-9 players. So I think that we ended up just within like the amount of players that we expected to have. So, yeah, I think it was nothing too unexpected. We just kind of, we obviously, like, every team has limitations that they need to play within, and we were able to, and like felt pretty comfortable doing so. So I wasn't, with the budget that we had and like the resource allocation that we had and whatnot, we were never like, it was never like a hindrance for us, I would say.
Okay. So before we go into the nitty gritty of each particular pick of the players that you kept and the guys that you signed on, we also have to talk about that you now have to sort of like divide responsibilities and also, I suppose, say over the roster with Junkbuck, who's your co-head coach. Now, you guys have a history. Of course, you work together in Shock, and you also work together for the US team and had some success there. So how did getting Junkbuck on, how was that decided?
I think that basically for him and for us, we had like the same goals in mind, where we wanted to make, we wanted to just build a new competitive team, like that could be like the face of, this is going to sound super lofty, but that could be like the face of like Western Overwatch. Like, obviously we're playing in the Western Conference now, or actually I don't know how it's labeled, but the American Conference or the Western Conference or whatever it is. But like, we wanted to make a team that I think that can be both marketable and that can be like very good in like that can win in Overwatch League, basically. So I think that his goals and our goals just kind of like lined up, and it just became like, obviously we've worked together a lot in the past, and like we're also like pretty close friends outside of that. So it was just something that kind of like naturally happened, I would say.
Right. Okay, so I guess we kind of have to unroll your transfer season from behind, or from the most recent one, because it also impacts coaching staff decisions. How did you come to the solution that you found with Jake?
I mean, in terms of like having him as both a dual player and a coach, I think that for him, like, he just is somebody that really likes competing, and so the opportunity to play is always going to be like kind of enticing for him. And at the same time, I know that myself, Junk, and Matt had all like independently thought of Jake as like someone with an outside shot of like like joining back in Outlaws and like becoming a coach.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was like we had brought this up semi like as like kind of like a long shot, and Matt was like, I've had this idea, and like I really want to talk to him about it, and we can make it, maybe we can make it work. So I would say that Matt like worked really hard on that, and from talking to Jake, he seems very like motivated. He's been like working a lot with us in scrims and like watching all the practice with us. And obviously, like if the scenario arises where he's the strongest player for a suited, like for a meta, especially if hero pools are back, then it could make sense for him to play again. So he's actually somebody who like plays Overwatch consistently still, as like a top 10 ladder player right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so like I don't think the skill is gone. So I think that for us, like it's cool to have like the opportunity for him to like come back, and if the chance arises for him to play, we'll like he's definitely not like never gonna play. I'll say like if the opportunity arises for him to play, like he'll play.
What kind of heroes do you see him like if he was to play in some metas? What are the heroes that you see him on?
Junkrat? No, I for now I'm not. For now we'll have to do like internal testing and stuff to see like especially because like he's scrimmed a very limited amount of time right now, so it's like we haven't necessarily seen the potential that we like need to know what he would be like best at, I guess, for the team. But I think definitely like that kind of projectile role is something that he could do. Or yeah, I mean, you never know. Like he's a very smart player. Like he's actually grinding all the roles in rank right now. So I think that there are just opportunities, and it just kind of depends on how like the meta goes, basically.
Do you think you find yourself, because okay, in my mind, like putting Jake in, especially now with the role as a player coach, it feels like it's more, it could end up being more a decision than just what hero is good, but also how does calling work out, and
sure,
what's the leadership structure around.
So one of the things we're being very active in terms of like, we're scrimming now 2-3 months, 2.5 months before the season.
Mm-hmm.
Is like setting up that structure and making sure it's like set for success. I think that you can have a solid structure no matter what, as long as like certain things are done and like certain people contribute to the calls. And I think that like moving him in and out, even though he's a very vocal presence, would not necessarily like it's not going to disrupt the team, I will say. Like I think that he's somebody that knows how to win. He's somebody that knows when he needs to focus on mechanics or when he needs to focus on calling. And so I think that it might not be as big of a change as it might seem on the outside, I would say.
Right. Okay, so this time around, I assume you had more say in what kind of a roster you want to build. And you changed a bunch, though not everything. So I suppose let's talk first about the players that you decided to keep. And an interesting one, especially in how this was framed from your guys' side, is hydration. Now you said like he's really good at taking on coach feedback and has the ability to just not have to heavily grind into finally understanding a concept or whatever that you're teaching him. Mm-hmm. At the same time, it sounds like you're moving him away from the main target role and you want him to play more of a DPS style. Is this still a way, because also JJANGU is the only main tank that you guys currently have, that he would, for instance, play the ball or play the Orisa for you guys?
So right now, JJANGU, I think, is one of the most insane like ball players I've ever seen, actually. So I'd say like for ball, let's say it's unlikely, but then I don't want to like, I know people are talking about how like he's going back to DPS and everything, but I think that I don't want to view it as linearly as that. Like if there's a situation where he should be playing, then in a different role, then he'd be playing in a different role. Like let's say, what if Ryan Orisa comes back and becomes a dominant force? Then maybe it makes sense for him to be on the Orisa and for JJANGU to be playing the Ryan. So
right,
it's just something that it's like it'll naturally happen. But he's focusing on playing DPS for now.
And what kind of a, because, okay, it looks a little bit harder to divide the champion pool now, especially with Jake in. Previously, I think with the KSF pickup, it felt like, okay, KSF is a little bit more hit scan focused. Like, that makes sense.
Well, I will say that Jake is, like, right now, I would say that he is very focused on coaching, but then, like, if the opportunity arises, he'll play, right? So what's right now is happening is that, like, we're obviously just splitting the majority of time between the other DPS players, and Jake is spending a lot of the time coaching with me and Junkbuck. So I think that we have like it'll make more sense as time goes on. Right now there is just like a dominant meta, and so it's like kind of hard to say how things will flow. Just because like there is just like a couple dominant comps and that's pretty much it.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're not gonna get too much out of playing other things. But I think that especially if hero pools is still the reality, I think that the meta will just shake up more, and it'll make more sense to play players on specific heroes should they become meta, right? So like let's say double sniper is meta, then it makes sense for Happy and KSF to be like, they're both very strong sniper players, right? Let's say it's like Ash Tracer again, then makes sense for, let's say, Happy and Danteh. So it's just like fitting together the best pieces depending on what Overwatch is at any given time.
Right. That's actually interesting. I haven't even thought about that, because if hero pools is coming back and you guys don't have generally mandated hero pools at the moment, that's a weird scrim environment, right? Where you're almost like once again focusing on one meta that's sort of dictated by the state of the game.
And I think the thing about that is that I think the way you can talk about it is to like learn the fundamentals and like why you're doing certain things, because the fundamentals will always, maybe comps will change, fundamentals will always stay the same, and then maybe specific parts of a comp will change, but then like let's say the Briggs-Zen backline comes back. Well, then the old Briggs-Zen fundamentals that you have will still translate to the new Briggs-Zen that you're playing, right? So it's like just learning patterns in the game and then saving them in your mind for future use, because Overwatch is like, I'll say like the metas can be like cyclical maybe, especially with hero pools where it's like artificially changing. You'll have patterns that you notice that you can apply from a previous meta into like a new meta.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the way you kind of have to look at it, even if you're practicing for something that won't exist in Overwatch League, right?
Right. Especially now with you guys also having to sort of make sure that communication works across language barriers. And I mean, there's no shortage of working at things. It's just interesting that you almost have to question if the league should just say, oh yeah, even though nobody in the world really is running hero pools, these are your scrim hero pools for now, so you can sort of adapt and everyone plays the same, right? Because the scrim patterns are pretty extraordinary to what we can expect, which is probably 2 weak hero pools again, right?
Some people started experimenting with that last season, and I remember we put one scrim during like a fake enforced hero pool. And I remember it was, again, I guess I won't say who it's against, but then I remember they were running Ryan Winston as their tank combo, and it was just like a really silly like environment. And so I was just like, if this is gonna be like artificially enforced, I don't know if people will find the best comp or like the best way to play.
Right.
But that, I guess that could be an interesting like artificial scrim hero pool. But then you know what? I feel like if you're doing that, you might as well just have the hero pool in the game, like enforced in like make it part of the game. But then I don't think that's the direction Overwatch is leaning. I think that people probably like not having their hero banned every game. So that seems, I guess, unlikely.
Do you think the league should then, rather sooner than later, come out with the news what they're trying to intend with hero pools? If it stays with the duration, so you guys can sort of adapt to it running up to the season? Because I imagine, like, also work patterns for coaches is very different if you have 1 week hero pools to 4 week hero pools, let's say, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then how you use your roster is also very different between those, and I think it changes a lot of things. So obviously whenever that news comes, I'm very eagerly awaiting it. But I think that setting expectations early on is definitely good, and it'll help us, think about structure and how we want to be approaching things.
Right. Okay, so off that tangent, we're now in your off season, especially about the guys that you newly picked up, and we already talked about JJANGU. So can you give us an idea of what kind of a player he is, what you expect him to excel at, and why you, at least for right now, have decided he's your only main tank?
Mm-hmm. He is our only main tank for now, yeah. So, I guess the things that stood out about him, he's not like a super vocal player, but he has like I would say like he has a very good like feel for the game, and he knows like individually he's just like a really gifted player, I would say. And maybe it's because he's a DPS player that turned into a main tank,
right.
several years ago or whatever.
Right.
But he's someone who like will always find individual value from his dives. And if I had to, like, I don't want to. People will think this is like speaking out of turn, but I'm just trying to talk about like styles. I would say if I were like trying to compare him in terms of a style to another player in Overwatch League, it would be he's like very much like how Smurf likes to play the game, where Smurf is like a very, he has like a good feel for like the flow of the game, and like he knows how to always get individual value. And I feel like I saw that in JJANGU as well. So I think we're just hoping we can get the same high highs that, obviously Smurf is able to bring, that we can get that in JJANGU as well.
Mm-hmm. The interesting thing, of course, about Smurf being that he has a super backup, right? In terms of the,
yeah, of course. But I think that I guess we haven't really gotten to see it that much. But then like I think that it's like one of those things where we'll never be able to say how insane super is. I mean, how insane Smurf is at Reinhardt, because he's literally just back up to the best Reinhardt in the league.
Right. Yeah, and to be fair, there's probably also something to be said about not having to share practice time on all heroes, so you can keep a specialization on more heroes, of course. But at the same time, I think it's a majority trend to, if I'm not mistaken, to just have one main tank this season for the teams that actually had to ratio down. And it seems like that's okay. Let's talk about this, because the pattern seems to be, if you only have a limited amount of players, you probably want to start out, for apparent reasons, to have more DPS players than necessarily required. What do you think? Like, what's the hierarchy of like, or is there a hierarchy? Does it depend on the specific players that you have, or is it like, okay, if we have only 7 players, then the first additional player is going to be a flex DPS, for instance. And then if I have 8 players, it's going to be a flex support. And then the 9th will be blah. Do you think there's a pattern like that, or is it more team dependent?
I think there is something to the pattern you just mentioned. Like, I think just the way it works out naturally is that the DPS role just has the most heroes, right? So you can't specialize as much into all of those. You have to like pick and choose, and for that reason, I think that's why teams often like go for their last, if they're in a 7-man roster, their last pickup would be like a DPS player to round out like a 3-man DPS core. That way, also there's like times where it's like double sniper, or like let's say you have like a dedicated projectile player, and then there's like Ash Tracer, and then you're between those two players you can't play the Genji when Genji comes back into the meta, right? So it's just like the way it works out is that it's just very natural to have like a DPS as your as an addition. I would say that I do think a lot of teams went for like that second flex support on the roster, just because there were so many double flex support metas during last year. And I think another thing that happened last year is that a lot of the best Brig players during the season were also flex support players.
Right.
So if Brig is going to be a very common pick, then maybe it makes sense to have that double flex support kind of like lineup. But Zenbap was a pretty common thing. Even the season before that, Anna Bap was played in that Bastion comp.
Right.
So it's just something that like it makes sense judging by history. And then I think it's just up to what the team wants, or the players that they have, what holes that they perceive. So I think that's kind of why it naturally goes that way.
Right. Now, that naturally kind of opens up the discussion about your support backline. And one of the interesting pickups that you made, and sort of in an unprecedented way, of course, we shouldn't neglect that, yes, some Overwatch players, like Moth, for instance, have played collegiate. They just weren't signed directly out of collegiate. But, I mean, just looking at this guy's life story, like, Joobi is not even 18 yet. He's a collegiate player. Don't know if people can run the numbers on that in their mind, but that means this guy finished high school pretty early and got into a collegiate program. So, like, what kind of a player do you expect him to be, and what's the sort of story of this guy?
He's like a very green player that we're like using this time in the off season to kind of. He doesn't have the experience, I guess I would say, of like the other Overwatch League like main supports, but then he's also, I would say, he's a smart player, and he's also somebody that like is very vocal, and I think that basically like getting him up to speed is like a priority for us, and I think he can be like a very strong player in the role. I will say, like, we weren't the only team that considered him. Like, I know a lot of people were looking at him as like a pretty talented player and one who's like very vocal. And essentially, like, we ended up landing on him because we felt that he would fit the role the best for us and like be kind of like a bridge for the communication in the team, and that we'd be able to mold him basically into, you know, being the best player he can be for us.
Right. Now, you only have 2 support players, so that means if there is, I mean, you talked about it historically, that there's a pattern of like requiring 2 flex supports. I don't know if that's an innate feature of Overwatch, or if it is, it's probably like a slight one maybe. But there's, of course, as precedented, a pattern that you might have to play him in a flex support position. Is he up for that?
He is. His most played hero, I guess, the previous season, because now he's grinding a lot of Brig, is his most played hero was BAP, so he's obviously like definitely trying to come up to speed for that. At the same time, we also have you know, you never know, we also have players like Hydration and KSF
right,
who can grind that out, so we'll see.
Right.
But definitely he's definitely aware that, you know, that expectation could be on him and that he needs to be ready if the time came.
Right. Now, we sort of heard through the grapevine that Crimzo was a highly contested player, and it makes sense, right? Because if you look at the teams that might want him, just also for brand reasons, I'm sure Titans were looking at him. I'm sure Defiant, if they wanted to go more heavily into the hybrid roster situation, they would have looked at him. Probably other teams too. Like, was that like one of the top agents you wanted to get this offseason?
I would say that Crimzo is one of the first people in terms of, you know, we held, I think, 3 weeks of tryouts, and over that time we came to more strong conclusions, like how we felt about players, and obviously we made the trials tougher and tougher. Like, we condensed the pool of players in each trial to the point where it's like only elite players at the end. But, you know, throughout the trial process, you're just trying to become more and more sure of how you feel about a player, and like you're like using the trial to like either confirm how you feel or to be like a counterpoint and make you like double think basically. And for us, Crimzo just felt really solid from the trials, like from an early point. And one thing we noticed was people said he was really easy to play with as well. And so we valued that a lot, and that's why he was like one of the people we like went after.
Right. Yeah, just to weigh in a little bit here on that point as well. That's generally the communication that I have from around the league, that he's just very professional for his age, which I suppose that's not an information that often goes out through the public. But of course, these, like, if your league is an average of 20 years old, there's going to be a lot of immaturity going around, right? Like, just necessarily, because that's not the age where you can expect extreme professionalism with
with Crimzo sort of being an outlier of that and having stuff figured out in that regard, right? So,
Yeah.
okay. Now, there is an interesting point about the off-tank that you picked up. Because if we look at the off-tank market, JJANGU is not picked up, Meko is not picked up, GBS is not picked up, and I assume those were also people that you looked at, especially, you know, having had Meko already. But you decided to go with PIGGY. So can you talk us through that process, how that went?
So Meko is still someone that we like seriously considered for the team, and so actually, as far as I'm aware, we were the only team that even offered him like a tryout, which was like mind-boggling to me during that offseason, because I still think he's such a strong player, and like I felt like he proved that he was such a strong player. But I guess for us, like at the beginning of the offseason, we knew it was already like 100% certainty that we'd be like letting him go FA, and then like we'd think about re-signing him. One thing that happened was Junk was able to scrim a bunch of Korean contenders teams when he went to grand finals in Shock, sorry.
Right.
So PIGGY is somebody that he noticed like immediately was like a really strong player. And he told me that Talon was basically one of the strongest teams, and like it felt like that they were just like miles and miles ahead of all the contender teams in terms of strength when they were scrimming in that meta.
Mm-hmm.
So PIGGY is somebody that we were like really interested in trialing because of that. And basically like immediately the first trial that we had with him, he was gapping like all of the other off tanks that we had in trials. And one thing that we really liked about him as well is that he had like he was a very vocal player. He's a really strong Sigma, which is a character that always seems to come back into the meta no matter what you do to him.
Yep.
And something that's rare for off tanks is he had a pretty strong Zarya as well, and he like communicated very actively on Zarya, which I feel like a lot of off tank players tend not to do. They play her more like a supportive like hero, even though she's very much like a main carry kind of character. So he just had all of like the right, I guess all of the right like ingredients to be like a insane off tank player, and that's why we decided to choose him.
Right. Yeah, the social media around PIGGY is interesting, where I think that it's really hard for people to judge. But I remember some people saying he's going to be the best off tank this year. Of course, that role is also pretty stacked, just judging by who's outside of Overwatch League right now in terms of the talent that's there. But yeah, like, do you expect him to be contending for like a top 5, top 3 spot in that position?
I don't know, because I think that position will be hard to evaluate on like things like Diva.
Mm-hmm.
I think his Sigma is insane though, and I think his like Zarya is definitely top tier for like the off tank. So I think that like for us, we feel that he can be a really strong player, and I think that is like he could like contend for one of the top spots, as long as he works at it and as long as like we play to his strengths, I think.
Mm-hmm. Now you also signed KSF, and I feel like that's probably an idea that was, or we can expect that this was an idea that was derived from your experience in Team USA, because of course KSF, also now a world champion if you want, did it together with you guys. Was that, did you guys realize, okay, that's, if we want to have this profile of also a Western roster element, that's a guy we should have?
I think we just wanted to make sure our DPS hero pool was like as expansive as it could be. So just to make sure we're strong in double sniper, in dive, in hit scan, tracer, just like anything you can imagine. We just wanted to make sure we had everything covered. So I feel like he brings a different hero pool than all the other DPS that we have. I also think that, like, yeah, definitely the experience working with him in World Cup was like at least something that we could look to as like prior experience, but also like he didn't get to play too much during the last season, so we definitely wanted to see him in trials, and he still performed well in trials. So we're like, he just checked all the boxes for us basically, and that's why we ended up picking him up.
Yeah. Now, the one guy we haven't talked about is, and I think
I think the concept of a franchise player is often brought up because it's an established concept for some sports in America, and then also, I mean, definitely there are also certain people in the sports teams that we support here in Europe, and people will understand that a player that's very good sticking with a specific team for a long time is a special thing. Mm-hmm. So, seems to me, of course. Yes, Jake is also a personality like that. I'm not sure if you could talk to him
franchise coach
call him
player.
Pretty much, yeah. But Danteh is like the one that stands out, and I would say probably was also the best player you had last season over the wide breadth of men. Like never really looked weak in any of them, and really performed at a high level. So, can you talk about what it meant to you guys securing that guy's efforts for another season?
So definitely, obviously that was like one of the first things that we did, and it was very important that we like retained Danteh because, I mean, like you said, he is like our franchise player, I guess. I think that just in the same way that Junkbuck had the same goals and like the same ideas in mind that we had, Danteh's goals and like ideas and like what he wanted to do with his season also lined up with what we have, and basically it became like a natural fit. So like he wanted to play here, we wanted to have him, and I think that also we just like created an environment that he'd like to play in basically, and it just became like a natural fit. So, you know, even though he was able to test free agency and like weigh up other offers and stuff like that, like we were just glad that he ended up choosing to come back, because I think that, you know, he's a player that can have like tons of different offers, and decided to take the one where he like thought would be the best environment, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Does he provide anything outside? Is he like a leadership figure, or does he bring anything else analytically to the team outside of his own server performance?
I'd say there are two things that he's really strong at, and one would be he always tries really hard and like wants everybody to be involved. Is constantly like talking during feedback, trying to you know, share his tips or his advice with other players, like stuff like that. And he just genuinely like really loves the game. You can like just tell from that kind of attitude, and the fact that he gets like rank 1 every season, like right. Just plays that much rank that he just loves Overwatch and like is very passionate about it. And I would say the other thing is he's just a really friendly person, like an outgoing guy. And I think that's good to have people like that on a team, because it brings everybody together really naturally. And, you know, I've had him in mixed teams before in Shock and in Houston last year. And he's able to kind of like bridge that gap between the Korean players and the American players like very seamlessly, I would say. Mm-hmm. He's just such a friendly person that everybody really gets along with him, I would say.
Right. Now, with all the successful moves that you made this season in terms of like signing these players, there must have been some developments, maybe not concrete free agents, but like ideas that you didn't really could push through because you keep competing in a market, right? Like it's not like you can just pick and choose like at a shop, but it's you're in competition for these players. So what did you miss out on?
I would say one thing, and I guess I'll be a little bit vague because I don't want to, you know, talk about everybody else's off season like that might not want to talk about it. Mm-hmm. But one thing I'll say is that like I think the general narrative around our team is that, oh, you know, Houston missed out on a bunch of free agents. Like for us, the way we felt was like we're happy with the team that we ended up building, and also there's like a reason that you were hearing, you know, X team and Houston are like the last two teams to be in talks with X player, you know, or Y player. I guess I used X already in this equation. There's a reason you're not hearing like a bunch of other teams are talking to this player, because a lot of players actually had the same goals in mind that we at like Outlaws had, and were considering us as one of their like final teams. You know, whether we missed out on them or not, it's not too big of a deal because we ended up building a team that we wanted to build. But I think that every team has to make concessions or needs to pivot during the offseason plan. Like they're planning from what they originally had in mind, and I felt like we were able to do that and like end up with the team that we wanted to have in the first place anyways. So, I'm not too worried about what happened in the offseason. I felt like we ended up building a really strong product anyways, and that's what we'll show, I guess, come whenever April, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that a couple of players aligned with the goals that you and Junk have. Can you talk about those? Like, what are the goals and expectations for Outlaws? Maybe more than just the range that you want to place at, even though that would be interesting. But also, what do you want to achieve this season?
I think we want to be just. So one of the things that we really want to do is we want to be like a team that fans can like, I guess, resonate with and really every time they go into the server, we want people to believe that we're going to be like, that we can win the match and that we're like, that we are one of the best teams in the league. The other thing is that we also want our players like, we want to have a spotlight on those players basically. Like we want, this is an org that like understands branding is really important, that understands like media is really important, and like knows, I guess, how to approach that. And so I think that being on a team where you're like treated as a superstar and also you're in a team that can win is like, those are like the two best things that you can have on a team. And those are kind of like the goals that we wanted to foster within Outlaws. And that's why I think a lot of people really either wanted to sign with us, or like considered us as one of their best options.
Can fans then expect a lot of content with your players?
Yeah, I'm sure they can. I think that's something that our team definitely wants to flesh out during this upcoming season, and we have like an updated office, an updated content studio, and stuff like that. And so I think that I do think that that's something they'll definitely flesh out a lot more.
Because the willingness to have constant media obligations, even though, yes, it's different if you do it in-house than from the outside. But yeah, that's a heavy strain on players and has been in the past, right? So, like, it
is, but I think that one thing that I think maybe players themselves don't understand is that like at a time where businesses are like struggling, you have to like view it as like earning your value.
Yes.
So I'd say, yes, there's value in placings in terms of bringing prize money to the organization, but you also have to help the organization in other ways. Like not only do you need to ensure that you do well this season, you need to ensure that you support the company to exist for more seasons, So I feel like we're at a level where our players are, understanding, and we have an understanding with the org where it's not going to interrupt practice, where it won't impede the players' biorhythm or their schedules or anything like that. So it's just something that we all have to work together to, put out content for the fans, to build brands, and to also win in the server. It's just something that has to be an understanding between everybody involved, I would say.
Do you think that should be a league-wide goal for all the teams involved, and everyone should be pulling their content weight?
I do think so, because I think that everybody within the league has a responsibility to ensure that their job, that they're like, even within self-interest, I feel like you want to ensure that your job exists within 1 year, within 5 years, within 10 years, right? So I think it makes sense for everybody involved to be supportive. There's obviously people that will take what I'm saying too far and be like, and like try and take advantage of the players and try and milk them for content whenever they can, and pull the contracts out or whatever. But I think as long as there's like a healthy balance, like nobody's harmed, you're building the players' brands, you're building your team's brands, you're meeting sponsorship obligations. It's like, it just is a no-brainer from my point of view.
Maybe almost self-interested research, but what do you think the tone of the content should be? Because in Overwatch, it seems like we've had a lot of success whenever we weren't as dead serious and like hyper criticizing everything. That definitely has a place, but it seems like if you look at the plat chat numbers, for instance, they have all the facets, and I think to a degree it's also underappreciated what kind of viewership numbers they get from an esports as small as Overwatch, while competing with viewership numbers as big as the biggest esports podcasts out there, right? So is a more fun side to content the approach that you see succeeding?
I guess I don't know, because I will say that like we have like a specialized like marketing team and like a
Right.
you know, the people responsible for, I guess, Houston's content would be not me.
Mhm.
But I'll say, I guess from my perspective, it seems like people really resonate with like the personalities of these like players, and like and you know, like you mentioned Plat Chat, like that's where they're all like goofy. Bren gets to be like silly when he wants to. Sideshow can be analytical, or he can be like goofy as well with like a shaved head or whatever. Like I think that it's just striking the right balance of like personality and I guess like stuff from the game itself. So I feel like it's up to people within that kind of like job market to expand on that. But I feel like there's like a proof of concept, I guess, from, you know, Plat Chat, from streaming, from whatever it is, where you can see like let's say Super is one of like he's like a funny, entertaining guy, and he's pulling up like really big numbers in terms of streams, right? I think it's just kind of like it's a really personality driven esport. I feel like at this point in terms of the content, and I feel like focusing on that seems like the right way to go.
Is there any chance we will see reporter Harsha in your content?
I would assume we won't see that.
Right.
Breaking my own roster moves.
Very good, very good. I mean, also if I remember the top hats, was it top hats where you did the interviews? Tip of the hats, yes. These types of interviews were always well received, I think, by the community. So hopefully we see some of those. Even though maybe
next tip of the hats.
Right. Then we went 2 hours. I think this is a good point to say thank you for the interview. And do you have any shout outs towards the fans? Any expectations you want to communicate towards them and what they can look out for?
Mostly just thank you to the fans for like their continued support. I know that like Houston has had a history of being like a struggling team, but I think that at least for this season, we feel like very confident in the product that we'll put out, and we want to be that sports team in Houston that can finally make the fans proud, without, you know, cheating allegations surfacing a year later. So,
right.
You know, the Astros, I guess, But anyways, I think hopefully we'll just make them proud. And I think other than that, thank you for the interview, but that's about it.
Thank you. This concludes the interview series with Harsha, in which he shared his insights on his well-traveled Overwatch career with us. If you want to see more content like this, hit like, subscribe, and the bell notification for all things esports with GGRecon.